The quiet streets of Millbrook, Alabama, were shaken to their core when 22-year-old Ethan Reynolds vanished without a trace one balmy spring evening. The disappearance of this charismatic young man sent ripples of fear and confusion through the tight-knit community. Ethan's girlfriend, 20-year-old Olivia Foster, was the first to raise the alarm. She had expected him home after a late-night study session at the local coffee shop, but as midnight approached, his phone went silent, and there was no sign of him. As the hours ticked by, a sense of dread settled over Olivia and Ethan's loved ones. Ethan wasn't the type to simply disappear. He was responsible, dependable, and always in touch. By morning, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Olivia, a bright and determined pre-law student, immediately reached out to her parents, Susan and David Foster. The Fosters had always been close to Ethan, welcoming him into their home and their lives over the past 2 years. But now, there was only an unsettling silence where Ethan's warm presence should have been. As panic set in, the police were called and an initial search was launched. The first breakthrough came when Ethan's car was discovered abandoned on a lonely stretch of road just outside the city limits. The vehicle was found unlocked, keys still in the ignition, but Ethan was nowhere to be seen. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence pointing to where he might have gone, and no witnesses to shed light on what had transpired that night. The local police department launched a full-scale investigation. What had begun as a missing person case was rapidly evolving into something far more sinister. Behind Ethan's disappearance lay a web of secrets that had been festering in the shadows of a seemingly perfect suburban family. At the center of this storm was Olivia's mother, 45-year-old Susan Foster. Susan had long been regarded as a devoted wife and caring mother, living what most would describe as an idyllic life with her husband David and their daughter Olivia. David, a 52-year-old successful real estate developer, often worked long hours, leaving Susan to manage their home and social life. Their existence appeared typical, structured, and enviable from the outside. But beneath the surface, Susan had grown increasingly restless and dissatisfied over the years. The passion in her marriage had waned, leaving her feeling trapped in a routine devoid of the excitement and intimacy she craved. The strain in Susan's marriage only intensified when Olivia started dating Ethan. He represented everything Susan wished she could recapture: youth, energy, and a zest for life that seemed to have abandoned her own relationship. Ethan, with his boyish good looks and infectious smile, had big dreams for his future. He was working part-time at a local gym to save money for graduate school, hoping to eventually open his own physical therapy practice. His ambition and charm quickly won over everyone around him, including David, who saw in Ethan the son he never had, and Olivia, who fell deeply in love with his kind heart and adventurous spirit. But Susan saw something different in Ethan. What began as innocent admiration soon morphed into something far more dangerous. She found herself longing for the attention and excitement that Ethan represented. The more time he spent with her family, the more her feelings intensified, slowly transforming from a quiet infatuation to an all-consuming obsession. Ethan, for his part, remained oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. At first, he was flattered by the extra attention from Susan. Small gestures, compliments, and moments when they found themselves alone, chatting about anything and everything. But as time passed, the boundaries blurred. Susan started finding excuses to be around him more often. She would show up at places she knew he would be, linger around their conversations, and create opportunities for them to be alone. What had begun as harmless flirtations spiraled out of control, and soon Ethan found himself entangled in an affair he hadn't meant to start. Ethan's initial reluctance was quickly overcome by Susan's persistence. She knew how to manipulate his emotions, playing on his fears and desires, convincing him that their relationship wasn't just a fling, it was something more, something special. The two began meeting in secret, always careful to avoid suspicion. They chose places outside of town, where no one would recognize them. Yet with each passing day, their secret became harder to keep. The once lively and affectionate relationship between Ethan and Olivia started to crack under the pressure of his double life. Olivia, intuitive and sharp, noticed the subtle changes. Ethan became more distant, avoiding conversations about their future and cancelling plans at the last minute. The easygoing charm that had drawn her to him seemed to have faded, replaced by nervous energy and vague excuses. He was distracted, often checking his phone and offering short, non-committal answers when she asked him what was wrong. But Olivia wasn't the only one noticing the changes. David, too, began to sense that something wasn't quite right. Susan had been acting differently as well. She was more irritable, often leaving the house for reasons she refused to explain and avoiding David's attempts to connect with her. But David always focused on his work, chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. He trusted his wife and saw no reason to believe anything unusual was going on. Still, the tension in the household grew. Ethan found it harder to juggle his relationship with Olivia and his affair with Susan. His guilt weighed heavily on him, and he began to regret ever allowing things to go this far. He knew he had to end it, but every time he tried to break it off with Susan, she found a way to pull him back in, convincing him that their relationship was worth the risk. One fateful evening, Ethan made the decision to meet Susan one last time. They arranged to meet at an old abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, one of their usual hideaways. He was determined to tell her that it was over, that he couldn't continue lying to Olivia. But things didn't go as planned. That was the last time anyone saw Ethan alive. The next morning, when Ethan didn't return, Olivia's world was thrown into chaos. His phone was still off, and she had no idea where he could be. As the hours passed, her concern grew into dread. When the police found his car, it became clear that something terrible had happened. Olivia, already anxious and scared, began to suspect that her mother knew more than she was letting on. Susan's erratic behavior, her sudden mood swings, and her evasive answers when Olivia asked if she had seen Ethan recently all seemed too strange to ignore. The once close bond between mother and daughter was now strained, with Olivia wondering if her mother was somehow involved in Ethan's disappearance. As the police investigation began to unfold, the pieces of a dark and twisted puzzle started to emerge. What began as a simple missing persons case would soon reveal far more horrifying truths than anyone in the quiet suburb of Millbrook, Alabama, could have imagined. As the days passed with no word from Ethan, Olivia found herself unable to sleep, consumed by the gnawing fear that something terrible had happened. The police were doing all they could, but it felt like every lead they followed hit a dead end. Olivia's gut told her there was something more going on, something her mother Susan wasn't telling her, and that feeling of unease only deepened each time she saw the way Susan avoided the subject of Ethan altogether. Susan Foster had always been the strong, composed figure in Olivia's life, but lately she was a shadow of her former self. At 45, Susan was still strikingly beautiful, with a presence that commanded attention, but over the past few months, her restlessness had become apparent to everyone around her, especially to Olivia. Her late-night disappearances, the strange glances she exchanged with Ethan, and her short temper all pointed to something deeper, something darker. What Olivia didn't know was that Susan had been hiding a secret that was tearing her apart from the inside. It had started innocently enough, a few compliments here and there, a lingering touch on the arm, a smile that lasted just a little too long. Ethan, with his easy charm and youthful energy, had stirred something in Susan that she hadn't felt in years. Her marriage to David, though comfortable, had lost the fire it once had, and while David was a good man, a reliable provider, he had grown distant, more absorbed in his work than in her. Loneliness had crept in, and Susan began to feel invisible, trapped in the monotony of suburban life. Ethan had changed that. He was young, full of ambition, and attentive in a way David no longer was. At first, it was nothing more than a distraction, something to remind her she still had her own desires, her own needs. But as time went on, her feelings for Ethan deepened, and she crossed a line she knew she should never have approached. The affair began with stolen moments. Susan would find excuses to be alone with Ethan, helping him with errands, offering advice on his future, or simply finding a way to bump into him when Olivia wasn't around. Ethan, who had been dating Olivia for over 2 years, was initially flattered by the attention from Susan. She was older, sophisticated, and she knew how to make him feel special in ways Olivia, with her youthful insecurities, couldn't. But Ethan quickly found himself in over his head. What started as harmless flirting escalated into something far more dangerous. One afternoon, when David was working late and Olivia was out with friends, Susan invited Ethan over to the house. It was supposed to be a simple visit, nothing out of the ordinary, but as they sat alone in the living room, the tension between them became undeniable. "I feel like I can talk to you," Susan said, her voice low and soft as she leaned in closer to Ethan. "Like you understand me in a way no one else does." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her gaze on him. "You know I care about you, Mrs. Foster," he said, trying to keep things light, but there was no mistaking the intensity in her eyes. Before he knew it, they had crossed a boundary that couldn't be undone. That night, Susan and Ethan began an affair that would haunt them both. They swore to keep it a secret. No one could ever know, especially Olivia. But as the weeks passed, it became harder and harder to maintain the facade. For Susan, the affair was an escape, a way to feel alive again, to reclaim the passion she felt had slipped away from her life. But for Ethan, it was a trap. He loved Olivia, but Susan's manipulation had ensnared him, pulling him deeper into a situation he knew he couldn't control. He tried to end things with her, but each time she would draw him back in with promises, with words of how much she needed him. "You're the only one who makes me feel this way," she whispered to him one night, her hands trembling as they met his. "Please don't leave me, Ethan. I don't think I can handle it." Ethan knew it was wrong, but he couldn't deny the power she had over him. And with each secret meeting, with each lie they told, the weight of their deception grew heavier. It wasn't just the betrayal of Olivia that gnawed at Ethan. It was the growing fear that this could only end badly. He knew he couldn't continue like this, living a double life, but every time he tried to break free, Susan found a way to reel him back in. And then something changed. Ethan started to pull away more forcefully. He cancelled their meetings, avoided her calls, and made excuses not to see her. Susan noticed the shift, and it terrified her. She had become obsessed with him, and the thought of losing Ethan, of him walking away and returning fully to Olivia, was more than she could bear. In her mind, Ethan wasn't just a fleeting affair. He had become her last chance at happiness. Ethan, on the other hand, was beginning to feel suffocated. He loved Olivia, and he hated himself for betraying her. But Susan had a way of twisting his emotions, making him feel responsible for her happiness, even as he struggled to find a way out. Things came to a head one fateful evening. Ethan had made up his mind. He was going to end things with Susan for good. He couldn't live with the guilt anymore. He arranged to meet her at their usual secret spot, the old farmhouse just outside the city limits, where no one would see them. But when Ethan arrived, he found Susan waiting for him, her eyes wild with desperation. She had sensed what was coming, and she was not going to let him walk away easily. "You can't just leave me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "I've given up everything for you, Ethan. You can't just throw me away like this." Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. "I'm sorry, Susan," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm. "But this has to stop. I can't keep doing this. It's not right." But Susan wouldn't hear it. "I need you," she insisted, stepping closer to him. "You said you loved me, Ethan. Don't you remember? You said we were meant to be together." The desperation in her voice sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He knew he had to get out of there, but something in Susan's eyes told him she wasn't going to let him leave that easily. And then, as if on cue, everything went dark. The sun had barely risen over Millbrook when Olivia woke up to a feeling of deep unease. Ethan was still missing, and the police investigation had reached a deadlock. Each day that passed without any news from him felt like an eternity. The silence was unbearable, and every ticking second only magnified her dread. The thought that her mother Susan might know something about Ethan's disappearance had taken root in her mind, growing stronger with each passing day. Susan's behavior had become increasingly strange. She was distant, agitated, and constantly finding reasons to leave the house. Normally composed and attentive, she now avoided Olivia's questions with vague responses and an unsettling calm that felt more like indifference. Olivia could sense that something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to confront her mother directly. Not yet. One afternoon, after David had gone to work and Susan was out, Olivia decided to search the house for anything that might explain her mother's odd behavior. She felt guilty for snooping around, but her gut told her there was more to this than met the eye. She went through drawers, cupboards, and Susan's personal belongings. There was nothing unusual until she found her mother's phone tucked away at the bottom of a drawer in the bedroom. Olivia hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew it was wrong to invade her mother's privacy, but something in her gut pushed her forward. With trembling hands, she unlocked the phone and started scrolling through the messages. Her breath caught when she saw the thread of texts between Susan and Ethan. At first, the messages seemed innocent enough, short exchanges about errands, updates on family events. But the further Olivia scrolled, the more intimate the messages became. Words like "miss you" and "can't wait to see you again" popped up, and Olivia's hands began to shake as she realized the horrifying truth. Her mother and Ethan had been having an affair. The texts told the story Olivia had feared but refused to believe, meeting in secret, stolen moments, and confessions of love that Ethan had hidden from her. As she read through the messages, her heart sank lower with each line. The betrayal was devastating. Ethan, the man she loved, had been with her mother behind her back, and Susan, the woman she had always trusted, had lied to her in the worst possible way. The last message in the thread was dated the night Ethan disappeared. It was from Susan, asking Ethan to meet her at their usual spot outside of town. The words felt like a punch to the gut, and Olivia's mind spun. Was that the last?